Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 30A, an interview on Silent Cal with David Greenberg. I'm excited to welcome David Greenberg to the show today. David is a professor of history and journalism and media studies at Rutgers University. He's also author of both Calvin Coolidge and Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency, which examines the rise of the White House spin machine. And we're going to talk a little bit about both of these topics today. David, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. Glad to be on the show.
So the first question I have to ask is, what inspired your interest in Calvin Coolidge?
Well, you actually just hit on it in a way. From some time ago, I was thinking about a book about presidential spin and tracing its history, which is something that really had never been done before. There were sort of books about individual presidents and their media relations, but nobody had really kind of tried to tell the overarching story. And at the same time, a series was coming out from Times Books, edited by the late, great Arthur Schlesinger, the historian. And I was approached to write for the series. And it's actually kind of a funny story because I was all excited. And then when I sat down to lunch with the editor, he proposed that I write the volume about William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison, as listeners may know, was president for all of 1 month.
Yeah. Short book, easy money.
Right. So I was actually a little insulted, and I said, oh, no, it's because your last book, my first book was a study of Nixon's image. Mm-hmm. You know, your last book was all about image, and the 1840 campaign was the log cabin and hard cider campaign, where they basically tried to reinvent Harrison as a man of the people to kind of take advantage of this new Jacksonian, populist, mass democratic, zeitgeist that was around in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So I said, well, maybe there's someone else who's we could think about. I kind of countered with John F. Kennedy. Turned out he was spoken for. My doctoral advisor, Alan Brinkley, was committed to doing Kennedy. So then I thought of Coolidge because I knew enough about Coolidge to know that he was a kind of unsung, underappreciated practitioner of spin in the time of the 1920s, which, we think of now as long ago, a century ago, but was really this great age of mass media and advertising. This was when Madison Avenue was getting to be a thing and public relations. And so I thought I could sort of use Coolidge as a way to explore, among other things, sort of the rise of presidential spin. And I also thought, frankly, not to sort of sell my subject short, there are many presidents about whom you really want to read a kind of Ron Chernow-sized, meaty biography. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily want to write Kennedy or FDR for this series because these are short books.
Right.
Whereas Coolidge, you do not want to read an 800-page book. Most people do not. And this is actually, I thought, would be the right length, a length at which you could learn what you need to know about Coolidge. I could put forward some original interpretation, introduce readers to some of this work in public relations that he was very good at, and do a number of things at once with this short book. So that's how I wound up writing the American Presidents series volume about Calvin Coolidge.
I'm going to say that you interpreted the opportunity there perfectly. I have read the American President series on Coolidge and William Henry Harrison and folks like that, and when I get to Lincoln, I buy a bigger book. So well done.
Exactly. And it's interesting, Arthur Schlesinger gave the Lincoln assignment to his friend George McGovern, which was sort of an odd choice. McGovern actually did have a PhD in history, though. Yeah. So it wasn't a completely insane assignment. But, of all the Lincoln books out there, it's not one that you hear people talk about that much.
Right. Because, frankly, there's just so many. Exactly. But so I'd love to talk about this. This is perfect, the way this all feeds together, because this Coolidge and how he evolves presidential spin and PR and takes advantage of all these new mediums of communication is really what I want to chat about. And when I'm reading about Coolidge, I feel like I'm almost getting a story of almost two different people. You know, I get this one set of stories about him being this dour stick in the mud, and I see this other set of stories. Oh, he's really, really funny. He's this great guy, and I'm wondering what's real. What is the spin from his side or the other side? You know, what's real? So let's just back up. When does Calvin Coolidge, this quiet guy from a small town in Vermont, have an aha moment about what good public relations and marketing can do for his political career?
Well, I think it is a bit more complicated than a single aha moment.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I argue in the book and really in the Republic of Spin as well is that the notion of, kind of goes back to Plato, that there's sort of a reality and an image. And the image is a deception or a distortion that sort of masks or obscures the reality. Mm-hmm. And I think, in fact, the relationship is somewhat different. The spin, the image, is really an expression of something genuine and authentic within the person. Sometimes it's partial. You don't see everything there is to see and know about a public figure in his public image. But when a public image is persuasive, when it's effective, it's usually because it expresses something that's really there. And so I think in Coolidge's case, this public image of Silent Cal did reflect, he was a modest man, soft-spoken, rather withdrawn, not necessarily the type who would be, a first, you wouldn't necessarily think of him as a politician for his career. At the same time, you see in high school, in college, he was a very good debater, orator. In those days, they took all these classes in rhetoric and declamation, and they had a whole series of different courses about public speaking, and he always won prizes for his public speech making. So he did understand methods of self-presentation, which, even before mass media, you can argue are a form of spin. How we present ourselves when we give a speech, when we talk on a program like this, there's going to be some difference from how we speak to, our spouse or our family or among friends in a totally private situation. So there's always going to be some awareness. I think for Coolidge, an important moment came in 1920. He was governor of Massachusetts, and there had been a police strike in Boston that was very controversial because, when the police go on strike, it's kind of a signal for criminals to come out of the woodwork.
Not great.
You're not great. And sometimes I think he's been misunderstood as, some arch conservative who hostile to labor, which was not really his politics. But he did come down hard on the police. The police had the police all fired and sort of said, there is no right to strike against the public safety. And that was kind of a quote that, attached to him and kind of elevated him to the point where he was being talked about as a presidential contender in the 1920 Republican, convention, pursuit of the nomination. And it was then that he actually works with a man named Bruce Barton, who is kind of a famous advertising PR guy of the era. And, the work is nothing that radical or dramatic. He puts out a book of Coolidge's speeches called Have Faith in Massachusetts. These are distributed to the members, all the delegates at the convention. So there is some kind of publicity operation going on in the hope of getting him chosen. He's not chosen obviously as the presidential nominee, but he does get on the ticket as the vice presidential nominee. And that's eventually how he becomes president when Warren Harding in 1923 dies. So I would say that certainly by 1920, he's aware of PR. He's working with PR men, or at least Bruce Barton, to think about his image, to think about how he's going to kind of elevate his profile and fashion an image for political success.
Now, maybe this is me stereotyping a bit, but when I hear of someone with a nickname Silent Cal, that's a nickname that evokes not wanting to do anything with media marketing or ads. You picture a guy who just wants to stay to himself, doesn't want to be photographed. So I'm curious if we have any sense of, did he have to be like kind of talked into this at all and working with Barton and putting out these pieces? I also think of, say, the stories about Richard Nixon in the first debate being told put on makeup and him being like, no. And then he looked horrible. And then he's like, okay, I'll wear makeup next time. Well, were there any kind of moments like that? Was there any talking into that was required to get him to buy into this?
Well, I mean, he was in some ways, I think, a skeptic of salesmen, of people sort of who had, some great remedy for, turning things around. He really believed that his own beliefs and his own record should be what shines through. And there are times where he reminded me of Nixon.
Yeah.
For example, in Nixon's Shadow, my first book, I made much of a famous story where Nixon, who was always so awkward and ungainly before the cameras, envied the Kennedys and how casual and how great they always looked. And so once when he was at his Western White House in San Clemente, California, called all the reporters and photographers to a bluff where they could come see him walking along the beach. And he comes out walking in wingtips and trousers. So he doesn't look Kennedy-esque. Right. Nixon looks like someone trying to look Kennedy-esque. The effort is very visible, the labors. And there's actually some moments like that with Coolidge too. He spends a lot of time at his father's farm in Vermont, which is on the site where he was born.
Yeah.
And there are these films, you can see them on YouTube, where he's like, for the newsreels, playing farmer. But again, he's wearing business shoes, and he's got this very odd looking smock on. And he doesn't look like, Joe Farmer out there.
Right.
But he gave himself over to it pretty readily. I mean, the photographers, and remember, the 20s was a decade. Photography was getting really big. Mm-hmm. The technology was changing, so you could splash these pictures on the front page of the newspapers. Mm-hmm. This was the era when the tabloids were getting to be a thing.
Yeah.
So he understands photography. And they would always want him to pose, and he was always willing to put on these costumes that made for great pictures. So at one point, he's made an honorary member of the Sioux Nation, the Indian tribe.
Oh my God, yes.
And he's out there. He's got the whole headdress on.
Yes.
I mean, these days he would get canceled for it.
Yeah.
But the Sioux celebrated this. They, and there's some other shots of him kind of wearing chaps and spurs, like in this cowboy regalia. He understood, okay, that getting that picture in the paper is important, and he sort of would dress up and looks kind of silly to us, and even at the time, but he went for it. So he was actually quite accommodating. Now that's you asked about silent, that's more visual, but even with the verbal, there is a little bit of a paradox, because yes, by temperament, he was, somewhat taciturn, not the most chatty fellow, but he understood what the presidency and what politics demanded. So, for example, he gave press conferences with greater frequty than any other president. He basically held them twice a week, personally held them twice a week with the reporters, not turning it over to his press secretary as later presidents would do. And he was out there answering questions. He went on radio, another non-silent way to communicate.
And here's Calvin Coolidge, 30 seconds of silence. No, just
Right.
kidding.
Yeah. So exactly. So he's very aware of the power of presidential speech, of what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit.
Yep.
And he uses it to the best of his ability. And as I said, he had been a champion speaker, debater, and so on. So he was actually, known to give good speeches.
Yeah.
Number of times where he's kind of the first, like the first to have his inaugural address broadcast on radio, the first to have his acceptance address of the party nomination broadcast on radio.
Mm-hmm.
So he's using his voice, he's using his words to communicate far and wide, again, in a way that's really innovative and groundbreaking, because this is the moment in the 1920s, when radio is becoming a thing and entering every household.
It's interesting how like these stories keep making me think of other presidents who have used these techniques too. Like you mentioned the farm. I think of when I was growing up, George Bush Jr. always going to the ranch in Crawford, making sure people got video of him looking like a common guy working on the ranch, And then the pictures makes me think of Teddy Roosevelt, who always wanted to have a camera around on his adventures. I'd love to dive more into. So this is what Calvin Coolidge is doing. How novel or unique is that to what's going on around him? What did the state of political spin look like in the 1920s? You've talked about some of these things like press conferences. He's doing them all the time. They're less than a decade old. Radio is brand new. Motion picture is starting to spread. How were people using these new technologies, and how was the American consumption of media changing at this time?
Right. Good set of questions. And, you're situating it in its historical time period is exactly right. I mean, I really credit Theodore Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson after him as being the most important pioneers. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who sort of, it's not just about the technology, they're the ones who have a conception of the presidency as a job that represents all the people and speaks to all the people. So people may not be aware. I mean, one reason that we don't remember that many of the 19th century presidents is because the job of the president was understood very differently.
Oh, yeah.
And Congress was really the central driver of policy, legislation, of course. I mean, that's its constitutional role. But Theodore Roosevelt comes along and says, no, the president really is the one who's directly elected by all the people. Like, he's not just answerable to some portion, one state or one district. President's elected by everyone and wants to go out and take his message out far and wide, and to use this kind of claim of popular support, as a way of driving the agenda. And Woodrow Wilson, who was himself a political scientist and an expert on the presidency from a scholarly point of view, feels the same way. I mean, there's some important differences between the two, but they both think the president is really, especially now that we have this big, complicated society with all these new economic and social problems to be solved, that it has to be solved from Washington, has to be solved by the president in particular, and that engaging with public opinion is really the way to do it. So they're the ones who I think are sort of the more important innovators in that sense. But Coolidge, look, you can either learn from what your predecessors have done or not learn. I mean, one reason Taft, who came between Roosevelt and Wilson, wasn't a successful president. One reason I think, I don't deal with him much in my Republic of Spin book, is he kind of wanted to go back to this 19th century conception of the presidency in many ways. And Coolidge, at least recognizes times have changed. We have these new media of radio, of motion pictures, as you say, and the newsreels that everybody's watching. And also, the nature of newspapers has changed so that, it's a faster paced publication schedule. There's a bit more sensationalism and focus on celebrity in the 20s. That whole kind of modern ethos of, the jazz age, the influence of Hollywood. If you think about it, another sign of the times, Will Hayes, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, goes to Hollywood and to oversee the motion picture industry. He's the one who the Hayes Code is named after, that regulated what could be shown in terms of sexual behavior. So politics and Hollywood, there's a real sort of interchange between them. Even before The Jazz Singer, which is 1927, credited as the first sound film. Calvin Coolidge makes a sound film from the White House lawn that they managed to get sound film and record a speech of him where he's speaking and he's being filmed. Again, you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's a little boring by today's standards.
Loses the plot in the middle, but yeah.
And it helps you think about, well, how has it changed? So presidents today, they always think about like their backdrop and the lighting, and there's all these other things that go into any presidential speech that maybe Coolidge wasn't yet concerned with, but he is very much kind of keeping up with what is cutting edge in communications, and in that respect, he is, I think, very much on top of things, and it has to be kind of considered an innovator. You can learn a lot from his use of radio and film and so forth.
Well, I'm curious, was this era of going into this increased radio, motion picture, and people consuming media that way, is it kind of comparable to what we've seen the past 20 years and the spread of internet and social media apps and all that, and just this huge shift and change into how people consume stuff? Is there a comparison to be made there?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, 1922 is often credited as the year that radio really kind of first starts to get a foothold. So you could find, a few speeches of Wilson's, for example, that are reported to have been sent over the wireless, and they're not even necessarily using the term radio yet, and they don't have these stations in different cities with their specific frequencies. This is all kind of getting sorted out in the 20s, and so by Coolidge's presidency, as I say, he gives like a State of the Union address to Congress.
Right.
Let's get that on the radio.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that's different, so again, to draw on the internet comparison or social media.
Sure.
Look at, Obama had a Twitter account for 8 years.
Yeah.
I bet nobody listening can remember a single tweet. A single thing he tweeted about.
Yeah.
Because he basically used it as just a form of press release. It would be like snippets from a press release or short things that you just want to communicate from the White House press office. And then Trump comes along, and Trump understands that Twitter is a particular medium. I mean, whether he understands this intellectually or just sort of intuitively, is not clear. But he understands it's meant for people like him who are angry and impulsive and reactive and want to communicate briefly and full of emotion. Like all those qualities of Trump's style, seem kind of built for Twitter. There's a happy convergence.
Yeah.
So we think of him as the first Twitter president, even though Obama was using it for 8 years. And I think if you look ahead to Franklin Roosevelt, he's the one who really takes radio and not only just hooks up a wire and broadcasts his inaugural speech across the country, as Coolidge did, but who writes a speech for radio these
Right.
famous fireside chats,
Yeah.
who imagines his listener as someone sitting home by the fireside with the radio on, and he's talking to that person, as opposed to Coolidge, who's giving like a classical speech of the sort he was maybe taught to give in high school or college,
Right.
right, as the
And
champion
now just get
speaker.
it into a box that's carried across the country. Yeah.
Right, but doesn't think about this more conversational tone,
Yeah.
this kind of more familiar quality and brief. I mean, those fireside chats were very short. So oratory is starting to change because radio has certain um, strictures as a medium, or I should say, it prefers, if we can animate it that way, if radio prefers certain kinds of delivery to others. So Coolidge is very important, but it's really not mastered until FDR comes along. And I do think that's like
Yeah.
quite analogous to the way we think about changes in internet, social media, communications, and the developments that we've seen with newer politicians coming along and finding more in there to
Yeah.
exploit and take advantage of.
I think that's a great analogy. Coolidge to FDR, as Obama to Trump. I could not name a single Obama tweet ever. I'll never remember anything Obama tweeted, but I'll never forget Cov Fefe. So,
right, exactly.
All right. So, is there anything else Coolidge did that was new, or is that kind of the limit of where he carried the baton?
Well, he actually is innovating in other ways. He uses a speechwriter, a man named Judson Welliver, who is a former journalist who comes to the White House staff, and he doesn't have the title of speechwriter, but it's understood that's part of his role. And years later, when they kind of formed a society of former presidential speechwriters in Washington, D.C. I think William Safire of the Nixon administration was one of the founders. They called it the Judson Welliver Society.
Nice.
So he's using speechwriters. He's using PR people. I mean, another person besides Bruce Barton he relied on was Edward Bernays.
Mm-hmm.
Bernays is very famous in public relations. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Mm-hmm.
Came to America when he was, a tiny boy. So grew up in America, educated, I think at Cornell. And Bernays wanted to sort of take the insights of Freud and psychoanalysis and sort of apply them to public relations.
Yeah. I think I remember his name in like psychology class in college. Like come up in that, how were people applying psychology to ads and marketing and PR?
Yeah, exactly. And there's others in the 20s who are doing this. A guy named Watson, who's kind of more behaviorist, but there's various efforts to bring psychological insights to bear on sales. And again, this is a decade of like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, kind of that salesman ethos. And yes, Bernays has quite the reputation, but some of it, I think, was kind of ironically enough his own PR. Because, I've looked at his work. I don't see like a lot of really deep, sophisticated use of Freud in what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And what he liked to do was stuff that was kind of misdirection, selling people something by seeming like you're selling them something else. So, for example, women were coming to smoke a lot in the 1920s.
Yeah.
There's a few famous stories about this, but one is he sort of started actually by using his secretary in a kind of subterfuge by having sort of women want to partake in like a march of the freedom to smoke down Fifth Avenue, and sort of winds up getting all this publicity. And he's doing this on behalf of the American Tobacco Company. But he also would do things like try to convince restaurants, which he did successfully, to put cigarettes on their menus as dessert.
What?
As Yeah, I mean, this was the idea that cigarettes could be a hunger, um, resistant, tool against hunger, and body image for women was a thing very much in the 20s,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
it has been since. Um, but I think a lot of these stories sometimes you you don't see the hard proof of how effective these sales
sure,
techniques are.
sure.
Some of them may have worked, others may not have, but it's a little bit different from the Bruce Barton method, which was kind of more a bit of a hard sell. Kind of,
Mm,
this is who you are. And when you see the silent Cal image that Barton had cultivated, there was some worry in the 1924 campaign that Coolidge was seen as too withdrawn, sort of too silent.
right,
Um,
right.
and they wanted to sort of perk him up a little bit. I mean, Coolidge agreed that he should sort of try to be a little more warm and sunny and friendly.
Yeah.
So it's actually not Barton, but Bernays who he brings on. They stage a stunt at the White House, and this is kind of classic Bernays, where a whole bunch of Broadway actors, and Broadway actors in those days tend to be Republican, take a night train down from New York, show up at the White House in the morning, where Coolidge and Mrs. Coolidge, really the White House staff, serve them a good old Vermont breakfast of griddled pancakes.
Yeah.
Um, and there's headlines, Coolidge serves Broadway actors pancakes. President almost laughs is one of the subheads. So it's part of the thing. Oh yeah, he's a regular guy. He's loosening up and
Right,
kind of,
right.
and so there's a calibration of the image. You don't want to be too withdrawn. You don't want to be phony either, and seem like you're not respecting what his innate personality is.
So as he's working with, a speechwriter and like a PR guy and like these new things that presidents hadn't worked with before, and he's putting out these motion pictures and these photographs and all this stuff. Was there anyone out there who was concerned about these developments, concerned about what this might mean for democracy, whether it's good for us? One thing I think of, I think of, say, in the past 20 years, I remember like Jon Stewart going on Crossfire and being like, this is bad for democracy, or questioning like, why do we have a spin room after debates? That doesn't seem healthy. Was there anyone like that who's just like raising their hand and being like, is any of this good for us? Or I don't like this or anything like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a whole literature that comes out of the 20s. Journalists, philosophers, critics who are very much aware of this culture of. It was a good 20s term is ballyhoo. Uh,
Oh,
and there was a writer named Silas Bent who wrote a book called Ballyhoo that's sort of a critique of the whole culture.
how did
And
they define ballyhoo? How would that be defined?
so Ballyhoo kind of it's just another word for promotion or
Okay.
publicity, but it kind of captures like that rah boosterish quality.
Yeah,
Hype
yeah,
might be a good synonym. And it's kind of interesting. So I mean, coming out of World War I, there was a great concern about what they called propaganda.
yeah.
um, I mean, originally it had been German propaganda because
Mhm.
we were being inundated with German propaganda to stay out of the war. But
Mhm.
once we decide to go to war, um, there's an American propaganda campaign that the
Yeah.
government oversees, and also a lot of private propaganda. Hollywood and others get in on the act. And then after the war, there's kind of buyer's remorse, and we sort of blame the propaganda for having
Ah,
led us into war, even
yeah,
though people wanted, thought it was the right decision. Germany did have to be stopped; they were sinking our ships. I mean, it wasn't really the wrong decision to enter World War I, but
right,
it didn't work out the way we wanted. It didn't lead to this flowering of democracy the way Wilson
right,
had hoped.
right.
Um, so propaganda, then in business, we see, the rise of what were first called press agents and then publicity men or public relations men. So there's an awareness that, and advertising too, of course, that we're being sold all this stuff. And there's an awareness that people have that this can't be, entirely healthy or just a
Yeah.
straightforward matter. So, one great set of critics are people like Walter Lippmann and John Dewey.
Hmm.
Dewey's a philosopher, Lippmann's a very philosophically inclined journalist.
Yeah.
They're writing about this. H.L. Mencken, the journalist, is, and also in my book, I kind of write about sort of the debate between Lippmann and Mencken, but Dewey's in the mix too, about, okay, so what should democracy look like? I mean, it forces
Mm-hmm.
people to start mapping out, okay, what's wrong with democracy? Are people easily fooled by
Mm-hmm.
hype, ballyhoo, word, image, symbol? And if so, what can we do to kind of strengthen people's defenses, or
Sure.
at least
Yeah.
their understanding of what it means to be a citizen, that they can sort of better cope with this kind of barrage of words and images that they now confront all the time. I mean, it's actually strikingly modern when you
Yeah.
read the debates that they have, like how even though this was 100 years ago, they sound very much like debates we could be having today.
Did all this ballyhoo and other press and material put out about Coolidge? Did this make your job harder to research Coolidge when you're working on your book? When you start seeing so much stuff and you're trying to figure out what's puff, what's artifice, what's real?
I guess so, in some ways. I mean, whenever you work with sources, you sort of want to try to understand who's the audience, or what is meant, what message is intended, like what are they trying to put across, and how might that be, again, not necessarily false, but a kind of partial representation of what the person really is or stands for. So I think that's always something one thinks about. But that, in a way, that's true even in earlier times, that people sometimes know not to commit certain things to paper. Even thinking about historians,
Yeah.
coming to read it, that there's sort of an awareness of um, what should and should not be said outright.
Yeah.
On the other hand, ultimately we do rely on our own judgment. And when you read and review, a whole wide range of sources and how many different kinds of people looked at Coolidge, you start getting a sense of the man. I mean, it's always, I think, a bit of a illusion to think that we truly understand these historical figures.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Fair point.
but you spend enough time with them, with different kinds of sources, with their critics, with their admirers, uh, and you start to see certain strains uh, of description that kind of run throughout, that say, "Aha, this seems to be something that people agree on is central to this person's personality, or his politics, or his understanding of the world."
So, you mentioned earlier that like what PR can really do is it can kind of shine a light on parts of a personality and cast a shadow of the other. It's more an enhancer than refabricating something. So when you look at Coolidge, what do you get a sense of? What was the true Coolidge and what was media Coolidge? What were the differences in those? And I particularly kind of mind the things I mentioned earlier, like when I see things where he looks like a real stick in the mud and just a pain in the butt, and times when people say he's really funny, like what's the real guy?
Well, I mean, I think those were both parts of his personality. Um, he was somewhat dour. He was sort of a stick in the mud, but he could have a sense of humor about it. There's a great joke that he told, or story about him, that seems to have been genuine. Sometimes you don't know if it's apocryphal when it emerges sometime later. But he's at an event, and a woman sort of, and his reputation as being laconic and so on
Right.
preceded
Right.
him. The public thought of him this way. And so this woman comes up to him and says, "Mr. President, I made a bet with my husband that I could get you to say more than 2 words this evening." And he looks at her and he says, "You lose."
Perfect.
So, like, is that the stick in the mud, or is that the guy who has a wry sense of humor?
Sure.
It's sort of both.
Yeah.
So I do think, you read, and I sort of read all the existing biographies of Coolidge as well as many magazine profiles. So I felt I had a pretty good sense of the man's personality. I think, a good way of understanding the seeming paradox about him was what William Allen White, who was a leading journalist of the era, a term he used. He called Coolidge the Puritan in Babylon. So Babylon being the kind of roaring 20s, a period when, things were opening up. I mean, despite prohibition, it was a time of changing sexual mores, even improvement in race relations, even though maybe not so much in the Deep South. But if you think of the Harlem Renaissance and, what's going on in a number of cities, a time of real creative ferment, a time of kind of go-go capitalism where all kinds of consumer goods like wristwatches and candy bars and stuff are now sort of things that people are buying regularly. Saying nothing of radio and so all of this, there's this real dynamism to the decade. And a lot of people felt that this kind of carried with it a risk of a sort of moral decay. And we've seen this in our own times, kind of coming out of the 60s, or even more recently, changes in attitudes toward sexuality. A lot of the country starts to feel like, we're headed for perdition or something like that, or at least have their worries that we're losing our moral bearings. And so Coolidge, William Allen White said, and Lippmann wrote a similar essay, kind of provided a sense of moral rootedness. He was an anchor. He was someone we could look to as a man of probity, of sound values, a bit old-fashioned. He wasn't, though, trying to like turn back the clock on the 20s. He wasn't kind of fulminating the way certain evangelical preachers of the period were about all the rot and decadence. But he was sort of quietly superintending it, making sure the economy stayed strong, trying to offer a kind of restrained moral vision that was, maybe a little Puritan, but not, not harsh or denunciatory.
Yeah.
And this kind of comforted people. This kind of made people feel like he was a man they could trust. He also, I should say, comes into office right after the Teapot Dome scandal that people don't remember much about, but was until Watergate for 50 years, it was kind of the big scandal and really devastated the Harding administration. Coolidge has it investigated. He kind of is seen as like a counterpoint, as a man, again, of moral rectitude, who's not corrupt. And so for all these reasons, he sort of presides over America in the 20s, a strong economy, a growing culture, lively culture. And so even though he's on the conservative side of things, he kind of makes people feel like the country's going to be okay because he's got his hand at the tiller in the White House. And I think that sort of captures these contradictions and shows how they are sort of reconciled in his personality as well as in his public image.
You mentioned several times the strong economy of the 1920s, which in many ways made all this change in media stuff, like it was all entwined in that and made it possible, and they fed each other. I feel like one of the important aspects of Coolidge PR was the idea of Coolidge prosperity, taking ownership for that, but the strong economy of the 20s. I'm curious, what do you think? How much credit does he really deserve for the strong economy of the 20s? And on the flip side, how much blame do you think he deserves for the Great Depression that hit a few months after he left office?
Right. I think with all presidents, we probably give them too much credit and too much blame for the fortunes of the economy.
Great.
There's just so many other factors that play into it. And yet, especially in the 20th century, but even in the 19th century, people want the president to solve these problems. It's almost kind of mystical. It's like this,
Yes.
father figure role, king role.
Mm.
We impute more power to the president, more kind of single-handed power than he really has. At the same time, economic policy matters.
Yeah.
I think it's often a mistake to see what happened in the eventuality and then say, aha, we should have seen this coming.
Sure.
And this is just a fallacy we always make. I mean, people try to pin 9/11 on George W. Bush, and I'm no particular fan of George W. Bush, but it's just ahistorical. Yes, there were certain warnings that came in, but there were also lots of other messages that came in.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a trick of the mind that in retrospect, we kind of can pick out and see the clues. But unless there were other people pointing to those clues and those clues alone, it's very hard to blame someone for having missed them. Or we see this with other economic crashes or all kinds of events. Now, that said, there were a lot of critics who criticized the Fed's behavior on interest rates, who criticized Coolidge for not doing more to restrain some of the wild speculation that was taking hold in the stock market, who pointed out that we need to do more to support particularly the farm economy, which despite the general prosperity of the 20s, farmers were still having a rough go of it. There was a book called Business Without a Buyer, which sort of warned of overproduction, that we were going to produce so much stuff without the consumer base to keep supporting it. And which is at least one analysis that economic historians have given of why the Depression happened. So some of those criticisms were on the table, that Coolidge didn't heed. So it's not altogether unfair to say that he missed the boat or could have done differently. At the same time, we don't know. I mean, I think the real test is on Hoover, who has the job of trying to find a way out and really can't and won't. And 1932, when he's running for re-election, things are pretty much as bad as they were in 29. Whereas FDR, we're not out of the Depression by 36, but at the end of his first term, there's considerable progress, considerably more growth, unemployment's come down, a lot of new programs in place. I mean, there's a lot you can say that he actually did. So I think it's much fairer to sort of look at Hoover rather than Coolidge, although, history does tell us that different policies at least might have pointed us in a different direction in the 20s when Coolidge was in power.
The next question is a question I like to ask everyone I talk to, and that's, what lessons in leadership do you think we could learn from old Silent Cal?
Well, this is a hard one for me because I really have become almost sort of dogmatic in rejecting the idea of lessons from history. I mean, it remains a kind of popular notion that a lot of people are interested in, and understandably so. But, when I look at history, I see such so many differences between any other period in our own time that I find it hard to sort of transpose, or to extract certain uh, behaviors or decisions and sort of find ways that they could be applied to today. I mean, we could say certain things about his personality and leadership style in a very general way. Um, but I'm not sure that we would need Coolidge to arrive at those lessons. I mean, for example, I do think respecting public opinion, kind of trying to keep one's finger on the pulse of public opinion, is an important part of presidential leadership, certainly in the media age of the 20th century. And presidents like, Hoover and Jimmy Carter, who couldn't do that or didn't do that, do tend to be seen as failures. Um, there are aspects of Coolidge's leadership that I think, at least as he articulated them, that I wouldn't particularly espouse. He liked to say, if you see 10 problems coming along the road, you can ignore them because 9 will run off into the ditch. And probably not the best advice. It seemed to have served him well in his own presidency, I guess, but maybe that 10th one was the Depression. So
that's the one quote. Whenever I think of Coolidge, that's the quote I think of, and I'm just like, can you imagine someone saying that today?
Right. I mean, and he was sort of in that sense a throwback to an older conception of the presidency that was more hands off. And you have to realize he came after this period of intense activism in the Oval Office, especially Roosevelt and Wilson. So he wasn't wrong to discern that the public kind of wanted a bit of a respite from all this crusading. Certainly the 1920 election, that's what the Republicans ran on. A return to normalcy was Harding's phrase. And in a way, Coolidge carried that forward. There are times where we need a return to normalcy, and Joe Biden basically won on a return to normalcy, although kind of defined rather differently in a different situation. So perhaps there's some lesson to be gleaned in the appreciation of someone who isn't always trying to kind of make history with some grand sweeping new piece of legislation. But again, I tend to think if we subscribe to those lessons, those are lessons shaped by our own politics and ideology rather than by our reading of a particular historical figure. They're lessons sometimes we take to history rather than from history, but we may imagine we're learning them from history.
I appreciate your contrarian take about lessons from history. Really, that's a fun one to play over my head. If you'd like to hear more from David, please check out his books, Calvin Coolidge, Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, or keep an eye out for the book he's currently working on about Congressman John Lewis. You can find him online at davidgreenberg.info. You can also give him a follow on Republic of Spin on Twitter if that platform hasn't just imploded by the time this episode comes out. Thank you so much for your time, David.
Thank you, Kenny. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast, if it still exists. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. It helps me buy books, pay the host of the show, and thank you so much to everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, it's time for the Great Depression and the man, the wonder, the brilliant Herbert Hoover, who fed starving Europeans during World War I, who brought aid to homeless Americans during the Mississippi Flood, who was teasingly called Wonder Boy by his boss Calvin Coolidge. If anyone can save the country from the Great Depression, it's Hoover, right? Well, we'll give him the old college try next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.